Ok, pessoal, boa noite. Estamos aqui para mais um Papo com Destri e dessa vez nós vamos ter um papo internacional. Vamos conversar com o Ricardo Giamattey, que vai se apresentar, e com o Bruce Crager, que também vai se apresentar a partir de agora. Então, lembrando. Okay, okay, no problem. So, Bruce, good afternoon. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Okay, and please, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, okay, Bruce. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So my name is Bruce Crager. I work with Endeavor Management in Houston, working projects around the world, including those in Brazil. And today I believe we're going to talk more about oil and gas in Brazil and what's going on there. And I'll share what I can as an outsider from the country, as opposed to somebody that's in on the day-to-day. My background is oil and gas, 45 years, started out in the drilling business, designing rigs for Transocean, and then I worked in production systems, floating and subsea for many years, including in the decommissioning market. So my background has been offshore oil and gas, and that's what I've continued to focus on. I've worked in Brazil since the 90s, actually 80s when I first started working on projects there, and have continued to be involved there as we've gone forward. We had recently done several webinars related to oil and gas in Brazil and oil and gas in general. And so some of the discussion today we think will cover those areas, and I'll be here to help with Ricardo covering more of the detail from Brazil. So I'm glad to be here today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ricardo, por favor, please, your time.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ricardo Giamattey. I'm Brazilian, but I'll be speaking in English, so Bruce and everybody that's not from Brazil can follow us. I've been in the oil and gas industry for 20 years. I'm an engineer by background, and I started my career at Petrobras, where I worked for 10 years as an engineer, both downstream and upstream segments. Then I left Petrobras and started my career in the private sector. I worked for McKinsey & Company, a global consulting firm, and then I worked for Baker Hughes as CFO, also CFO for a medium company in Brazil that played the GNG workspace onshore named Georadar. And after that, I just became an independent consultant in the last couple of years. The dynamic here is that I'll give the word back to Bruce, and Bruce will talk a little bit about the global outlook on the oil and gas sector. And then I will, the word will get back to me, and I will summarize this special report that we have just published at World Oil Magazine, and this report being the base of the discussion today. So Bruce, if you can walk us through a little bit of what you're seeing in terms of global oil and gas outlook, focusing on the offshore industry, which is your expertise. What can you tell us?
Okay, and in addition to the World Oil article that Ricardo mentioned, which he was the primary author on, we have another one coming out in Offshore Magazine, January, which has some of the same information, but it's a little different take. It's more of a worldwide focused on offshore. So what we're seeing, as everyone knows, price of oil has been down, supply and demand has been out of sync. COVID has caused a significant amount of that, but also the oversupply from OPEC plus Russia. That has corrected itself in that I believe supply and demand are going the right direction, but we had excess supply, and so we're having to use that up. And eventually we should get to a point where those are about matched. That is expected to be in end of this year, early next year, where supply and demand are pretty close to being on track if we can use up the supply. And of course, the COVID resurgence may slow down the excess supply, and it may take us a little longer. Pricing is a different problem. we have seen that prices drop significantly due to oversupply and to COVID. And that has started to creep back up. I noticed we're up in the mid 40s generally for price of oil. Projections in the last week have been better than they were a month ago, and projected by some entities that it will be up to closer to $50 a barrel by 2021, certainly by 2022. And so we think that that's a significant difference over what we were even 6 months ago. More importantly, it's projected that those will stay relatively flat. Now, that's a very hard thing to predict, and so we'll have to wait and see how that pays out. But what we've found is that most companies could work very efficiently and be financially well off between $50 and $80 a barrel. And so if we could stay in that band and operating companies had confidence that we would stay within that band, I believe they will reinvest, continue to go forward with projects that may be on hold or being slowed down. And so that's the future in the next year or two, is that projections will be back above $50 a barrel, that supply and demand will be synced, and that we will have a relatively flat, least fluctuating that we've had in the last few years. Now, the second issue that's going on is what you might call the pivot, and that is pivot from renewables and non-fossil fuels to those options, as opposed to the fossil fuels that we depend on today. Projections is that oil will stay relatively flat for the next few decades. Gas will go up just because it's a cleaner fuel, and people will switch over to gas, and it's available. And that coal will be in reduction, but there are still new coal plants that have been built in the last few years, so it's going to take a long time to get off of coal. That excess demand that comes on beyond what's being taken up by fossil fuels will come from renewables and other non-fossil fuel sources. So, for example, offshore wind or wind in general, solar, other areas where we can make up the difference in energy demand. But these are very small markets right now. They make up on the order of 10% of what we use today. And by 2040, they're expected to be about 25% of the energy supplied today. A significant increase, but it is not going to change the overall world use of energy, particularly fossil fuel energy. Now, the other thing that makes that interesting is that the major oil companies are switching into these new areas, but their fields will be sold off to smaller companies. That's happening in Brazil right now. Petrobras is divesting some fields, or they're keeping operatorship but bringing in partners in some fields. And as they do that, the companies that take over those fields will typically be focused on increasing the production from the existing reserves and finding more reserves. So, for example, if there's an existing field, but it was drilled 20 years ago, now they may find that there's pre-salt there, and we have the technical capability to go in and drill the pre-salt. And so that should be a plus for those production from those fields. May not be by Petrobras anymore, but some other company will come in and do that. It's important to remember that every well, in almost every case, is in decline. And so after we find those wells, we are in a scenario where the production has dropped off, and they either have to be renewed, worked over, or more wells have to be found to continue production from that field. So we will struggle just to meet the projected need for oil and gas going forward, particularly if some of the majors drop out. It's going to take a significant effort by the oil and gas industry just to meet the requirements that we anticipate. As I said, they're not reductions, or very small reductions in oil and a slight increase in gas. So basically stay flat on where we are today with wells going into decline. So we're going to have to keep going forward as an industry. And then the renewables will come in. There will be technical advantages. There are still economic hurdles to be overcome to make some of those projects not technically, but commercially feasible, where they will make money. The companies that do that will make money, because an energy company, what used to be referred to as an oil and gas company, still has to make money. Their shareholders have to benefit, all their stakeholders have to benefit, and so it has to be done in an economic manner. And in some of these technologies, we're not quite there yet. So that's probably a pretty good overview of where we are, Ricardo.
Okay, Ricardo?
Yeah, after this overview that Bruce just gave us about the global oil and gas, which pretty much is will be in business for a long time. We're not going to disappear, if I may summarize
Yep.
what Bruce has said. I would like to enter the special report we have written about Brazil, because what mesmerizes us about Brazil today is the amount of different initiatives, all related to oil and gas and energy in general, that exist in the country. And it's been a, a bit more than 20 years since we left the monopoly. We know that only the upstream segment has evolved into a more competitive market. We're still waiting for the downstream and the gas markets to become more like a non-Petrobras market. And this is a great opportunity for the country. So the motivation to write this report, and it's pretty much in the title that says all in for the oil and gas industry in Brazil. So it's been 20 years since we're no longer a monopoly. And so it's time to really speed up the growth of the oil and gas industry in Brazil. And opportunities for this are there, you see. But one of the questions that we have is that, does the country has the capabilities, and by capabilities I mean financial resources, I mean physical resources connected to the supply chain, and human resources connected to all the talents that are necessary to put those projects moving forward. So this is the big question of the articles. Is the ambition and is the set of opportunities that the country presents today in line with the capabilities that the country has to offer to the companies, in order that we really can speed up growth and take advantage of all the opportunities that we have today? And then in the report, we go through all these opportunities, and we also highlight the challenges that are connected to them. So what I'll do in the next 5 minutes is try to summarize what we have written on the report, and then in the questions that we'll be answering, we'll go deeper in each of the points. What we see today is that Brazil has mainly three levers for growth in the oil and gas sector and the overall energy sector. We have the pre-salt, which is close to be the biggest offshore province of all time in the oil and gas history. If the optimistic scenario of 5 million barrels a day by 2030 actually happens, we will be bigger than the North Sea in terms of how fast we produced a very big amount of oil. Today we are already ahead of Gulf of Mexico in terms of production. We just need to chase the North Sea. And you all know that the pre-salt ecosystem brings a lot of opportunities. Opportunities for the supply chain, opportunities for the human resources that have been entering the market in the last 20 years. And a couple of days ago, I was talking to a friend, and I say that I belong to the first generation of professionals in the oil and gas industry that could choose not to be a Petrobras forever employee. In the 80s, and if you enter the oil and gas market, you were making a clear choice to be in Petrobras for your entire career. And my generation is the first one that has had a choice not to be in Petrobras for all their careers. And as I said, I spent 10 years in Petrobras, and I was there when the pre-salt was discovered. I was there when the production kicked in 2010. I was there when the idea of the replicants, the 8 replicants, was created by Petrobras. That in the end we know that didn't work as well as the company expected. But pre-salt is perhaps the biggest lever that we have today to make the oil and gas industry grow in Brazil. We went from 0 to 2 million barrels in 10 years, and we have the intention to go from 2 to 5 million barrels in the next 10 years. And for that, 15 new FPSOs would be starting production. And this forecast is only based in the areas that are already known, like Búzios, Tupi, and Mero, and Bacalhau, which belongs to Equinor and is operated by Equinor, and another area operated by Shell. And we're not including anything from exploration that could come on stream in the next 10 years. We're not including anything that comes from the production sharing agreement areas that were auctioned by ANP. We already had 5 auctions of production sharing agreements, and we're not including any drop of oil coming from those areas in our forecast for the next 10 years. So there's a clear upside in terms of production. And the same way we lost 400,000 jobs in the entire industry in the last decade because the country and Petrobras as a whole, due to several reasons, including the car wash corruption scandal, all these jobs that we have lost in the last decade, they can come back in this decade because we pretty much are going to do more than we did in the last decade. But the first challenge that we have is the supply chain that we need in place to cope with all the challenges that we have to develop the pre-salt. Do we have the regulatory framework that we really need, the best one, to put these things forward? And what about the natural gas? You see, what are we going to do with the billions of cubic meters of natural gas that are being currently reinjected in the pre-salt, and they could come to shore if the capex conditions allow for a competitive price of this gas? And I quote what I heard last week in the Rio Oil and Gas, one of the sessions, a specialist from the International Energy Agency. He said that within the current framework that we have for natural gas in Brazil, he believes that the oil will have to pay for the gas in the pre-salt so the gas can be competitive on the shore. And this is not the kind of message that we like to hear. But nevertheless, the pre-salt is the main lever for growth for the next 10 years. Lots of jobs will be created, not only on the capex side, but also on the OPEX side. And especially on the OPEX side, there will be a lot of room for Brazilian companies to play an important role in this growth. The second lever for growth in the oil and gas energy is the Petrobras divestment plan itself. So when Petrobras decides that they want to focus on the pre-salt development and on the cluster of refineries in the southeast of Brazil, and they decide to leave the onshore and leave lots of mature fields, what they are saying is that they believe that other companies can generate more value out of the assets they are divesting than Petrobras itself. So it's pretty much like what Bruce said. The companies that are buying Petrobras assets, they're going to want to do better than Petrobras was doing. And for that, they'll have to invest. For that, they'll have to hire services. For that, they'll have to put a lot of capex. For that, they'll need operation and maintenance guys to put everything forward, and not only upstream offshore, but also upstream onshore, and the downstream that we're starting to see some movement in the refinery sales. So the message here is that the creation of a non-Petrobras market from the divestment program of Petrobras is also a big opportunity for growth in the oil and gas landscape in Brazil, just because the new owners will want to make more than Petrobras was doing. And this is the path for job creation and for value generation. We will be seeing a lot of that in the next 10 years. The timeline is not very much precise, especially now that COVID has hit the global economy and also the Brazilian economy. So it's not very clear how fast things will resume, but it's doubtless that growth will come. It might take a little bit more than originally expected, but growth will come and a lot of value will be created, and this value will be distributed between the private agencies and the society. And the third lever for growth in Brazil is all this thing with biofuels and renewables, because Brazil has the potential to be a leader in the market for biofuels, as it was in the past and is trying to be again, with ethanol and biodiesel and new technologies of the green diesel being produced by Petrobras in the next years. And also on the renewables, we have a lot of potential. I'm not sure if you are aware, but among the 10 biggest economies in the world, only Brazil and France don't have their energy matrix dependent of oil and gas in the order of 80%, meaning that 8 out of the 10 biggest economies have more than 80% of their energy matrix anchored in fossil fuels. Brazil is not, and France is not. But France, we don't consider, because France has a lot of nuclear. So in terms of renewables with sustainability, Brazil is the only a top 10 economy in the world that has a clean energy matrix and has the potential to keep on growing on that and becoming a leader on the biofuels and also on the renewable side of the business. So the final question in our report is that, will the country, and when I say country, I mean the oil and gas industry plus the governmental bodies that are part of the story, will everybody be able to cooperate in a sense that all the value that can be created will be unlocked, or this decade will not be as good as it has the potential to be? The ambitions are very high. The capabilities maybe are not that high right now. So the industry and the government and all the stakeholders they have to cooperate in order to speed up growth in the oil and gas sector in Brazil. So it pretty much summarizes what the special report talks about. And now I think we're going to start the questions from Destri to me and Bruce when we go deeper into each part of the report that we have written.
Okay, Ricardo, so good night. First of all, can you share these articles of us in my page in the LinkedIn, please?
Yes, I can do that. The link for the article I posted as a comment in the post when you advertised this interview, and also when you
All
post
right.
the YouTube link, I'll once again post the link for the article.
This night, later, after our job here, I will go again and put that again.
Absolutely.
So, first of all, I will subvert my mental sequence to ask you something, okay? So, my first question, because I'm so curious, is to Bruce. Bruce, here in Brazil, in Campus Basin, Petrobras is investing many fields, okay? So there in North Sea or Gulf of Mexico, you can see the similar movement to do that. Open yes.
Okay. So you're asking, is the out of Brazil activity continuing, or is it slower than Brazil?
No, it's
Is that the question?
And in nowadays, Petrobras are investing many of fields together at the same time. You can see the similar movement in North Sea or Gulf of Mexico. So the big companies are investing these small fields too.
Yes and no. Brazil is clearly one of the bright spots. Pre-salt is a perfect example, but even the old fields they're changing hands, and so people are doing things. The Gulf of Mexico continues to go forward, maybe not as vigorously as it did in the past. North Sea has slowed down some, but there are still projects there. And then there are other bright spots. The Guyana-Suriname area, which is more like Brazil, it's typically deep water, very early days, exploration is still taking place. Is another place where I think there's going to be a lot of growth. And then there's places like Mauritania, Suriname, where BP has their large gas field. Tortue is another big project. Mozambique is expected to be another big project. So yes, there are projects around the world and fields around the world that are growing. But I think Brazil, partly because of Petrobras's understanding of the reservoirs and the technology to develop those reservoirs, and geographically, it's a very small area. The pre-salt polygon doesn't even show up on a globe. So you have a very small area with a huge amount of activity going on, with more partners coming in now, like Shell and others that are coming in with Petrobras and also actively on their own. And I think that that's made Brazil one of the primary spots for investment, and other places are continuing to go forward, but not as aggressively as Brazil.
In Brazil, I think that we have another situation that I think that's very curious too, because in 1997 in Brazil, we just have Petrobras and maybe Shell, maybe another just one company. Nowadays we have 40 companies operating here in Brazil. So you can see the similar things like that in Brazil, maybe in Suriname, in Guyana, I don't know. You can see something like that because it's many companies is growing inch by inch here in Brazil. You can see something similar.
Yes, and one of the things interesting to me about Brazil is the international oil companies are clearly moving in and have moved in for many years. But now there are Brazilian local companies, which is a whole new thing. Some of them are 10 years old. They haven't been there very long. Some of them are brand new. And they are beginning to not only be engaged, but they're beginning to operate. And I think that's a real change in Brazil. Part of it is those that have worked in the industry, for example, in Petrobras, and have moved into local companies. Part of it is those that have worked oil and gas in other parts of the world that have now moved into Brazil and formed a new company. I think funding is there, maybe investment is there because Brazil is an ongoing, long-term, viable market. And the operating costs are very low because the wells have very high production rates and tend to produce for very long periods of time. So if you had to list a bunch of investments, you would certainly put Brazil high on your list if you're an international oil company. And if you're a local oil company, you see now that you could move in, take over properties, and probably do better than Petrobras, which is no different than the Gulf of Mexico. The large oil companies are not as efficient as the small oil companies because they have so much to do. So if you give a company that has 5,000 barrels a day or a field with 5,000 barrels a day to a little company, they'll try to get it to 6 or 7 or 8. If you give it to Petrobras, it almost doesn't get attention, or to Shell or to Exxon because it's too little. And so I think we're seeing that around the world. Certainly it's happening in Brazil. It continues to happen in the Gulf of Mexico. It's happened in the North Sea. Smaller companies are taking over those fields. And that, I think, is making more opportunities for the service companies because now there's more customers out there. We had gotten to the point where there was not enough customers to service the client. The service companies didn't have enough options, right? So if you are a subsea installer and there's only 4 companies in that country or 2 in that country, you don't win anything from those 1 or 2, you're out of business. But if there's 40 in that country, you have a lot more opportunity to win work and to do things. I think it's better for the industry, it's better for the little companies, and it allows the large companies to move on to new, typically unproven areas and bring those to fore.
Ok, thank you. Ricardo, agora eu vou falar em português por causa dos vários alunos, because of any students that are watching us, okay, Bruce? So I speak in Portuguese to Ricardo and asking him to answer in Portuguese or English, okay, as well. Ricardo, na linha do que o Bruce falou, nós temos grandes oportunidades. Várias operadoras estão surgiram, nós já somos 40 operadoras, pequenas operadoras, algumas que até 3, 4 anos atrás eram empresas de construção e montagem, por exemplo. Né? Uma empresa que construía shopping center, por exemplo, comprou um poço para poder aprender. Olha que nível de empreendedorismo nós chegamos. E o Bruce falou muito bem, that you have many opportunities, muitas oportunidades para várias pequenas empresas também de prestação de serviço. Agora, e para os meninos e meninas que estão na faculdade agora, que estão saindo da universidade, depois eu vou fazer outras perguntas mais acerca do artigo, mas é só para aproveitar a oportunidade, que conselhos você daria para esses que estão estudando na área de petróleo, gás ou similar, e que pretendem entrar e fazer parte desse mercado de muitos campos investindo, muitas operadoras chegando, e que vão precisar dessa oxigenação de mão de obra. Que conselhos você daria para quem quer entrar nesse mercado? Se quiser traduzir um pouco do Bruce, fica à vontade.
Bruce, I'll be responding about human resources. What kind of opportunities we see for students and professionals that have graduated not a long time ago within this process of Petrobras divesting and new companies coming on stream to invest and operate new areas. So I think that when you decide to buy an asset from Petrobras, what you do is that you put together a group of 15 to 20 people to assess what's the value of that asset, and then you negotiate with Petrobras, and all of a sudden you have an asset that requires 100 operators and I don't know how many people on the headquarters just to back up all the operations and further investment and then further growth. So I see that 20 years ago, when I joined the oil and gas industry, what we are seeing is that Petrobras people were leaving to be the CEOs of the majors that were coming to Brazil. When I left Petrobras in 2012, it was, I think, the best moment to enter the private market because everybody was coming to Brazil. So everybody would need help to establish themselves in Brazil. And now we have what I think will be a shortage of technical expertise in Brazil, because those small companies, not the small, but the mid-sized independent companies, it's not like they can bring 150 people from abroad to do all the technical things that are required to manage and to invest in mature fields. G&G, petroleum engineering, operations, HSE, all of those expertise, they will not hire people that today are very well established in the majors, and they will not import knowledge from their headquarters because they simply cannot afford to bring that amount of people to Brazil. So they will have to rely on local workforce. And I see this being more true for the technical areas than the managerial positions, because these companies still rely on their executives from abroad to come to Brazil and be the CEOs and the C-level guys. So if I could give an advice, I would say all in the technical areas of oil and gas and energy as a whole, because this is where the demand for high skilled professionals will be in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you, Ricardo, and very good answer. So, Ricardo, continue with you, please. Perspectives of oil and gas in Brazil. Okay, what are the levers for oil and gas growth in Brazil, in your opinion, please?
So I would see for oil and gas in Brazil, one is going to have to be more operators, as we've already discussed, more companies that are moving forward. And they're not just the big fields, they're the small fields. They're renewing production or increasing production in existing fields. There will be obviously exploration, but that's generally going to be by the international oil companies working in the deeper water depths, as well as for Petrobras. I think the other lever is going to be a shortage of personnel. It's definitely happening around the world, and I think we'll see it in Brazil, in that as we've cut back on staff, and as Ricardo mentioned, there's been a huge number of reductions both in the operators and the service companies. Many of those people have either retired or gone on to other industries, and it's going to be difficult for us to fill some of those positions. So in addition to needing investment as we go forward as an industry, we're going to need people. And those people, in many cases, the students that might have gone into oil and gas have found other industries or other interests, because they don't see it as a viable long-term career. Those that are in the business that are more experienced are generally the first to be retired or asked to be retired, primarily because they're expensive and it's assumed they won't be there much longer anyway, which leaves middle management and younger folks, engineers, for example, who don't have the experience and will make the same mistakes that those of us that have been in the business for many decades have already made somewhere in our career. And so I think that's going to be a problem, is the people side and being able to find the right people to do the work. Typically that will increase salaries, wages. So maybe you can keep up, but when there's not a pool to draw from, everybody will be hiring from each other. And that will be difficult for the industry because you don't have a long-going or long-term supply of personnel that will be with that company on a long-term basis. So I think that's going to be the levers: finding investment, having more companies engaged in oil and gas and the exploration production of fossil fuels, and finally having the right people to do that.
Okay. Is the pre-salt the most relevant offshore bright spot of the industry today? What do you think?
Yeah, I do, because pre-salt is a small area, as I said earlier, relative to the whole world, but in one country and in one market, it is a very large area with a huge amount of oil. As Ricardo said, it could be up to 5 million barrels a day. That's bigger than almost any country in the world. So it becomes, just the pre-salt becomes a really large amount of oil and gas that has to be dealt with. So the bright spot is that it's not just one company. For example, it's not just Petrobras. It's not just one area that needs to be determined. There are various blocks in there with various ownerships and various drivers. There are multiple companies who have the technology to do that. Even if it was developed by Petrobras, the way Petrobras drills and completes a pre-salt well is now known to the company that drilled that well, and they can do the same thing for another company. So the technology developments have been shared either actively or just by osmosis as people have learned to do what was done by the first people in that particular area. So yes, I think probably the single biggest bright spot in the world today for offshore oil and gas is the pre-salt.
Okay. Jumping to you, okay? And now is your time. So we can see so many opportunities, but so many challenges. What are the industry-specific challenges and in the country general challenges nowadays? What do you think?
Yeah, this is a very good question because we have to split what are the challenges that are intrinsic to the oil and gas sector, and what are the challenges that are intrinsic to Brazil that affects pretty much all value chains that exists in the country. And on the oil and gas specific challenges, I think that me and Bruce have talked about human resources, especially on technical positions, uh, because it takes some time to learn how to do these things. And we have like people with 30 years of experience, and then we have people with less than 5 years of experience. So the window for transfer of knowledge is not very large. So the human resources, the shortage of talented professionals, especially on the technical skills, can be a challenge. But I also refer to the supply chain. As I said, we have lost 400,000 jobs last decade, and those jobs have to come back so we can grow, because we want to grow more this decade than we did last decade. And even if what we see now is a lower um requirement of local content on the capex side, I always say there's the entire opex side that has to be dominated by Brazilian companies. This is a kind of a ecosystem that Brazilian companies have to dominate. If we don't have all the capabilities to in terms of shipyards and all the technology for risers, to produce risers in Brazil, or to produce flexible lines in the amount that is needed, but we have the entire OPEX part of the industry to take the leadership. So the supply chain has to be repositioned. It was kind of destroyed, if you will, especially on the onshore ecosystem in the second half of last decade. So the supply chain has to be back, and the big players, they are here. They just hibernated a little bit, but there's a lot of room for middle companies in the supply chain, or even small companies. And when I say supply chain, as I said, I'm pretty much concerned about the onshore ecosystem, because since Petrobras haven't invested in the onshore business for 15 years, uh, the supply chain is lagging much more on the onshore than on the offshore. And then if we look at Brazil as a country, there's one thing that we have to admit. Brazil has never been and continues not to be a very competitive country in terms of attracting foreign investment. We have a very complicated tax system. We we change our minds very often in terms of where the regulation goes. So this lack of stability in the regulation sometimes also frightens a little bit the private investment. And there's a big question about, will Brazil grow decently in this decade? And when I say decently, I say it has to be on average more than 3%, so it can make any difference for the competitiveness of the country. And okay, the COVID has made it worse because there were lots of reforms that the government wanted to do and could not do because this year was very, very non-typical because of the COVID. But Brazil has to improve in the sense of becoming a more competitive country. And for that, regulation must be very progressive. Institutions have to be very stable in a sense that it's not like the judiciary is the most important thing that can rule left or right, and you never know what you're gonna get if you have a problem in terms of your operations in the country. And first and foremost, the expectations about the economy have to improve. Expectations about Brazilian economy today are not the best. We have lost a lot of traction in the last decade, and somehow we need to create a much better environment in terms of expectations, especially for the second half of this decade, to attract all the capital, all the private companies, investments that we need to speed up growth in the oil and gas sector.
Ricardo, a gente tem na linha, ainda seguindo a mesma linha, nós temos ouvido falar muito, pessoal aí do LinkedIn, pessoal que milita na área de óleo e gás, né, tem ouvido falar demais sobre novo mercado de gás no Brasil, né? Mercado de gás está indo para frente, PL 6407, votação no Senado, enfim, novo mercado de gás no Brasil. And so about the new market of gas in Brazil, natural gas from the pre-salt, okay? How real is growth opportunity? Isso é realmente uma grande oportunidade para o Brasil? Como é que você enxerga? How real is this growth opportunity for Brazil?
The answer is it's a big opportunity, but not necessarily it will come to fruition. And there are lots of reasons for that. The first one is that Brazil is a continental country. Just for you to know, US is a bit bigger than Brazil, and they have 5 million miles of pipeline in the country. I don't think we even have 20,000 miles in Brazil. So also the production is very concentrated in one geographic area, which are the Campos and Santos Basin. And how we can think about the Brazilian gas market? It was not a relevant market before this century, and it really began becoming important when we had the risk of lack of power in the country because of the rain cycles and everything in the beginning of this century. So all this urgent power plants program that were built, and it has led to the construction of the Bolivia-Brazil pipeline. And in the sense, the Brazilian market became whatever Campos Basin could give, plus what came from Bolivia, which were what, 50, 60 million cubic meters a day. I would say Germany is the size of Bahia state, and Germany has a 350 million cubic meters a day market of natural gas. And everybody has two expectations: that the companies will find a way to bring the pre-salt gas to the shore so it can enter the market either for power plants or for the grid, for residential use and everything. But then I'm just give you a illustrative number, is that if you take what you pay in your apartment for natural gas and compare to the lifting cost average on pre-salt, we're talking about 50 times more. So I pay 50 times the lifting cost of the pre-salt in my natural gas consumption. And this number isn't absurd. And if this number doesn't come down, I would say 40, 50%, there's no chance we're gonna have a decent gas market in Brazil. Uh, and there are two things that really complicate the story. First, the investment necessary to bring the gas from pre-salt to the shore. I would say that the gas pipelines and the gas processing facilities, they are as expensive as the FPSOs and the subsea and the wells themselves. So it's like you have two projects in one. One project to extract oil and gas, and another project to take the gas onshore. And when the International Energy Agency experts said last week that the oil will have to pay for the gas, it's hard to listen, but I cannot disagree completely with him. Maybe if oil stays at 50, 60 and investment levels stay at current numbers, what, $500,000 per kilometer inch of gas pipelines, plus $1 billion for 10 million cubic meters of capacity of gas processing, those numbers just don't make me believe that a competitive natural gas market in Brazil will be able to be created. And then what happens is that regulation has to be much more progressive on the midstream, uh, on the offshore pipeline regulation, and on sharing processing capacities. And the idea that just taking Petrobras out of the picture will make everything work, this is a false idea. If you read the proposal of the new gas market, I think it's Article 15 that says that uh, while there are no other suppliers in the market, Petrobras will have to supply the market. So the story cannot be about taking Petrobras out of the picture and the market will resolve itself. It won't. So what happens now, especially when you looked at yesterday, the Ministry of Energy decided to eliminate the inflexibility of the power plants, so they can dispatch 100% all the time. They'll be in the base of the system. This actually creates demand for natural gas. This actually creates a lot of demand for LNG, but at what price? So if we believe that natural gas will be the transition fuel for the energetic transition that the world is thinking, so it's natural to believe that LNG prices will go up. The prices are already at $11-12 per million BTU at the Japanese and the South Korean markets, and we're not seeing the US export a lot of LNG. And I think that Vaca Muerta in Argentina will continue to be dead for a long time because Argentina is in deep trouble with their economy. So the thing is that we the way things are today, we would have a natural gas market with prices at the same level of Germany. When we don't have an economy, we don't have income generation at the same level of Germany. So given the size of the country, given the fact that it's very expensive to take the gas from the pre-salt, which is the ultimate supply geography for domestic gas, given the probable high prices of LNG in the longer term, given the energetic transition, and also gas from Bolivia and gas from Argentina, which could be low price sources for Brazil, they're not likely to happen in the next decade because of the economic conditions of those two countries. So I don't see how we can meet the expectations that the government has for a 200 million cubic meters a day of natural gas market by 2030. I don't think the price will clear this market, and I don't think that demand will be created unless we find a way to make this gas much cheaper in Brazil.
Okay, Ricardo, thank you. And so, Bruce, now I'll introduce you a new question that is for an issue that I love too much, that is a decon, okay? All right. So, Brazil is starting the decon era. What are the challenges and what are the lessons can we learn from other geographies?
Okay, and DECOM has kind of got a Jekyll and Hyde concept, and that is that for many years, people believed it was better to clear the seafloor of anything that was clearly any floating facilities and any subsurface facilities, and put the seafloor back in the condition it was before we ever introduced oil and gas production. We've now learned that that's not necessarily the case. For example, there is environmental reasons to leave things there. In many cases, the oil and gas facilities become an artificial reef. Pipelines do that, subsea equipment does that, platforms definitely do that. And so we've actually created an environment that encourages the fish and other animals or growth, flora and fauna, to be more than it was before. So commercial fishing is enhanced, recreational fishing is definitely enhanced, and we have supported areas that were relatively inefficient in terms of fishing out and things like that in the past. So, but because for decades we've had this idea that it was better to pull everything out, it is very hard to change that. The OSPAR initiative, which is primarily North Sea companies, signed many years ago, was to clear the seabed, and you can get a derogation or an approval to leave something there if it's unusual, usually if it's a very large structure like the concrete structures, and they're just not practical to remove. So other places like the Gulf of Mexico has been a little more forgiving and said, if you can show a benefit to the environment, it's never about cost, but if you can show a benefit to the environment to leave something in place or to topple it in place or to move it to another location to create an artificial reef, that will normally be approved by the government. And in the shallow water where the states control the jurisdiction, those facilities are approved by the state, Texas and Louisiana, for example, and half of the savings from not removing that structure goes back to the state. So not only is the oil company saving some money, but not all of it, because half goes back to the state, the facilities have been left in a way that's been approved by the government. So for example, if you had a fixed platform in 300 feet of water, 100 meters, then you might remove the deck, cut off the structure below the water line to maybe 50 meters or 30 meters, just so it's clear for transportation and for other activities. And then it's marked on the charts. It's already on the charts. It's a fixed structure, and people can fish around it, and transportation can go over it, and it's used for that purpose. Brazil is interesting in that generally Brazil has had almost no decommissioning. Those floating systems have come out, and there have been a few things that have come out. But in general, there has not been a decommissioning market in Brazil like there has been in other parts of the world, specifically Gulf of Mexico and North Sea. And so now there's a whole discussion in Brazil that's been in at least 3 or 4 years. I've been in this discussion, at least on the fringes. And what we found is that there are those that believe it's better to leave it, and there's those that are better to retrieve it. And the leave versus retrieve is an interesting argument for all the reasons I just said: fish counts, other benefits, and negative effects of doing something at the end of the life. To make it more difficult, you have the sun coral, the invasive corals in Brazil that were brought in from other locations. And if you go in and remove things, you are likely going to spread the sun coral. If you leave the facilities there, the sun coral is going to live there, but it's already there. And it's almost impossible to remove all the sun coral. So that one area, or that one issue around the invasive corals, is fairly unique to Brazil. It may happen in other places, but I've never heard it in the magnitude and the significance that it's got in other parts of the world. So from an oil company perspective, it is purely a cost effort. It is extra money out of their pocket to remove those facilities and adds no value to them. From a social standpoint, it may or not be better to remove or retrieve it because of the reasons just described. In fact, there's environmentalists now in the North Sea that are promoting leaving things in place because of this idea. It becomes an environment for the habitat for the ecosystem that remains. So we've been doing work in Brazil looking at the idea of leaving or retrieving based on multiple criteria. Cost is one, risk is one, greenhouse gas, that is vessels going offshore and generating more carbon emissions to do the work. Safety is one. You're more likely to hurt somebody working offshore to recover a facility than if you don't recover the facility. And so when you put all that together, you should be able to make a more scientific concept on how you do that, or scientific decision. So we've been promoting that as endeavor. We've got a joint industry project that's trying to get started that'll work on that. It'd be our second in this topic. But what we're finding is that companies don't want to spend money to study the topic, and they sure don't want to spend money to do anything about it unless they are forced to, normally by regulations that come into place. In Brazil, those regulations are just coming out from ANP and others, being reviewed and commented by industry. And Mauro, you're actively in that, so you know that's a big part of what's going on there. But what I haven't seen yet is an industry that has actually done it. The industry exists around the world, but it doesn't exist in Brazil. And those companies that want to move into that in Brazil, for example, recovery and decommissioning or breaking up facilities that come in, I'm not sure they fully appreciate the magnitude of the effort in dealing with NORM and other issues, so radioactive material and mercury and arsenic and all the things that can come out of a subsea well or a well have to be dealt with. And so it's interesting that, for example, we've worked decommissioning projects in Mauritania, but the materials were taken back to the UK to be dismantled because they had the facilities to do that. So there's a lot of issues around it that are both environmental and risk, and I think that's going to take some time to resolve in Brazil. But there are fields already that have been sold to be decommissioned. And because IBAMA seems to be unclear about what they want to do, ANP gets stuck, I think, between the operators and IBAMA. It is a very unclear issue as to how do you resolve that to get everybody to agree what's the best way to decommission, particularly in Brazil.
Oh, thank you. Guys, the time is passing too fast. So I have many other questions for you, but I have to open now to Laís, because Laís will ask some questions from the people that are listening to me, okay? So Laís, please, go ahead. You can do it in Portuguese, and as we need, Ricardo translate to Bruce or me, okay? Go ahead, Laís.
Já tem, boa noite a todos, já tem uma pergunta da Mari Malvão, até em inglês. Good evening, watching you from Miami. Would you like to know if Mr. Giamattey has any knowledge about norm in this decommission process planned in Brazil? Thank you and congratulations on the event.
I would have to admit that both Mauro and Bruce are much more knowledgeable than myself on the decommissioning part of the business. So I'm quite if it's a Brazilian thing, so probably Bruce must not be aware. So if Mauro wants to make any comments, so we can try to add something after you talk about it, would be very happy to do it.
Okay, Mary. So we have many of problems about the norm process in Brazil. Okay, the first of all that the license or we call anuência, you know it better than me, the license to maneuvering norm here in Brazil is came through two regulators, distinct regulators, IBAMA, okay, and CNEM. And if the norm is the category 1, no problem. No problem because we can discharge it, no problem. We will have to treat before and then we can discharge, okay? But if the norm is the category 2, this is a big problem because there is no way, okay, to treat, to clean this kind of the discharge from the operators, and so we have to keep it in a special place determined, like the norm that came from the usinas nucleares, from the usinas nucleares. I remember, I forget the name, exactly the name. So this kind of things could cause to the decommissioning process many troubles, mainly to the operators, that if the norm is category 2, they have to keep it in place in a special place. I don't know for how many times, because as I said to you, there is no way to treat it till nowadays. Okay, Bruce, can you complete something? How it happens in other country, or Ricardo? I don't know.
So I think your question, Mauro, is what do they do with the norm? Yes. So, and I'm not an expert in the norm, but we work with companies that do that. There are ways to deal with that. So norm is naturally occurring radioactive material. It's in the earth. It's just that it gets in concentrations, for example, on tubing or in process facilities. And so it can be removed. It can be, for lack of a better term, washed and diluted. And so it can be dealt with, and there are technologies to do it and chemicals to do it, but it's not common in all around the world. It's only common in places that have dealt with it over the years. Australia's dealt with it in the past. Even mining has some norm associated with it. Clearly the North Sea, the US has dealt with it. But in Brazil, I think it's a fairly new thing because decommissioning is a new thing. So there's not a facility, to my knowledge, and to do it. There are companies that can come in from the outside and help with that. We're actually doing some work with Petrobras right now to help them with some of their other related issues with crude oil. So it's not uncommon around the world. It's just that Brazil doesn't have much experience with it.
Okay.
And if I may add very quickly, I normally say that if you don't have a solution, you don't have a problem, because if you cannot get rid of this hazardous material, then you don't have a problem. You have to leave it there. So the decision becomes much easier. Then you have the option to leave it or not leave it. If you cannot take it out, so you don't have a problem.
Keep it here. Yes, okay. Laís, please, another question.
Sim, agora tem outra pergunta do Dan. Ela é um pouco longa, então vou tentar ler mais pausadamente. Empresas que optam pelo crescimento inorgânico, aquisição de ativos já desenvolvidos, realizam um esforço financeiro bastante elevado para adquirir esses ativos. Isso significa que raramente essas empresas terão recursos financeiros para comprar os ativos e imediatamente investir em projetos de aumento da capacidade produtiva desses ativos. Como os senhores entendem que o supply chain, no curto prazo, poderia apoiar a geração de caixa dessas empresas, fornecendo alternativas de aumento de margem operacional, menor OPEX, assim, lá na frente, facilitando as grandes oportunidades de CAPEX aparecerem? Os senhores entendem que esse seria um razoável nível de cooperação que poderá destravar o valor aos poucos desse mercado não Petrobras que está sendo criado?
Essa pergunta é para o senhor Ricardo Giamattey.
That's the kind of question I like, because you already gave the answer. You see, you're perfectly correct. You see, when you put together a new company and you raise a lot of money to buy an asset, you will not have more money to start from day one new capex projects for enhanced oil recovery or ring fence exploration. What you'll have to do, you have to wait some years, 3, 4, 5 years. You will depend on the cash that is generated by this asset to reinvest. So the capex opportunities will appear, but only on the medium to longer term in these new companies, these new entrants, you see, because they have to raise debt, they have to raise venture capital, they even have to do IPOs just to buy the asset. So they need the cash flow from the asset to be able to reinvest, and then in the medium to longer term to have higher production. So what those companies are looking for are for what we call the low-hanging fruits, which are the optimization levers they can deploy in the short term, actually to work in what you said, the operational margin, because the lower the OPEX, because prices we can't control, but the lower the OPEX, the better the margins will be, the better the cash flow will be, the better the ability to go into capex mode the companies will have in the future. So this is a clear case where the cooperation between companies and supply chain and operators is the best thing. Because, for example, if you are on the ESPs market, for example, ESPs tend to be a low-hanging fruit for onshore fields. You just change lots of ESPs on your wells, you recomplete wells with new ESPs, and then you increase marginally your production. But when you go for a infill drilling project where you're gonna drill like 300 new wells, you're also going to need the same ESP that you needed before on an OPEX perspective that now has become CAPEX. So why don't you see a cooperation between operators and ESP providers? Because in the shorter term, they sell less because it's just low-hanging fruit. But in the longer term, if they are partners, they can think about a long-term demand, and long-term demand is good for everybody because it's the best way to share the margins within the sector. If you have if you don't have cooperation, if you have competition between the oil operators and the supply chain, it's very likely that you won't generate as much value as you can. So you need cooperation. Companies need to understand that the beginning of the process, both upstream and downstream also, will be companies generating enough cash flow to go into capex mode in the medium to lower term. And if the supply chain can contribute to lower the OPEX in the short terms, it's probably a win-win situation when cooperation will arise. And in the longer term, the demand will be there. because the capex phase will start, and the same companies that play both the opex and the capex sides will benefit. So this is why I say that the short-term focus is OPEX, and this is the market that has to be dominated by Brazilian companies. It doesn't make sense to bring international companies to do OPEX. It has to be dominated by Brazilian companies. And then when the time comes for the CAPEX, the companies will be already there to continue with the partnership perspective, where cooperation built during the OPEX phase will continue on the CAPEX phase. Bruce, would you like to add something on that?
Yeah, one comment I was saying was an example, and that is PetroRio had the Polvo field, and they bought an adjacent field. They're about 9 or 10 kilometers apart, and each had an FPSO. So they recognized the synergies of releasing one FPSO, adding some piping and umbilicals to get the two connected, but they are significantly ahead going forward because they have one asset, that is the FPSO, producing the two fields. And I think that's an example of Ricardo's comment about Brazilian companies coming in and doing that. Neither of those two fields was developed by the single operator. They were developed by separate operators who have now sold off to what is now PetroRio. And I think we'll see more of that, for example, with the work that's going on with other divestitures in Petrobras. Some company will buy one from Petrobras and one from another company, or two from Petrobras, but put a lot of focus in a geographical, very tight area where they can cut costs, save facility money on logistics and other things, and be more efficient because they don't have to run a very large company. They have to run a very specific field.
Ricardo, I loved the phrase, if you don't have cooperation, you have competition. Pessoal, olha essa frase, uma frase bem legal. Se nós não tivermos cooperação, nós teremos competição. Nesse ramo, competição pode levar muita gente a um destino não tão bom quanto a gente espera. Laís, nós temos uma última.
Sim, temos uma última pergunta do Carlos Frederico Bastos. Vivemos um período de aumento de produção até os anos 2010. Desde então, muitas mudanças. A luta para esticar a vida útil de campos maduros, em paralelo ao trabalho de descomissionamento das unidades, campos que já atingiram o fim do ciclo. No horizonte, mudanças de padrão de consumo e na matriz energética mundial. Como a indústria deve, então, se preparar para cenários tão distintos?
Ricardo, essa frase está bem aqui embaixo, a pergunta. Será que você poderia me ajudar? Seu inglês é muito melhor do que o meu, e traduzir para o Bruce. Eu queria que o Bruce respondesse essa pergunta.
Bruce, in a sense, what was asked is that, okay, Brazil is divesting a lot, lots of mature fields to be redeveloped, production onshore has all the possibility to be bigger in the future than it has ever been. But at the same time, everybody is thinking about a smaller oil and gas market going forward because the energetic transition and the decarbonization of the world is at full speed. Do you agree that there is a risk for this revitalization programs that they don't find demand, or do you think that they will always find demand because the oil and gas industry may shrink a little bit but will never disappear?
So, and I believe that we will see a continuing, somewhat level need for oil and gas. But as I said earlier, all the wells we have are in decline, so we have to be in an exploration and replacement mode on an ongoing basis. We have poor recoveries in most of the world. If you get 30 to 40% recovery on a subsea well, most companies are happy with that. That's all they can get. That's leaving 60 or 70% of the oil in the ground. So it's there in many cases. It's going to take a long, long time for renewables to take over. And there will be, not that we can't get there, and I think that the world will figure out how to get there. And hydrogen and other sources are going to be important. They're going to become significant as we go forward. But even electric vehicles in the U.S., the number of vehicles that are run on electricity are infinitesimal. There are almost none relative to all of the vehicles that do run on oil and gas. And we have almost no biodiesel, so it's going to take a long time to get off of that. So I think the answer is the oil and gas industry will be a vibrant industry. And what's hurt the oil and gas industry between COVID and supply and demand has nothing to do with the long-term renewables. Over time, renewables will impact it, but really they'll take up the slack where we may not be able to generate enough by oil and gas, or we will at least not have to generate as much going forward. And it'll be better for the planet, obviously, to have renewables. But we have to be careful with that because some people count wood burning as renewable. Well, I'm not sure that's good for the planet, and it's not good to be chopping down trees and burning them just to call it a renewable. So I think we need to be focused on what's going to be better for the long-term benefit of the planet, not just something because it's not a fossil fuel. We're going to call it a non-renewable, call it a renewable.
And if I can add something to what Bruce has said, is one thing that I don't see this discussion happening a lot, but the natural market for the oil that will be produced by the companies that are buying mature fields for Petrobras are the refineries that are being sold by Petrobras. So this is the natural market. It's not like mature fields that produce 20,000 barrels a day and will go to 30,000 barrels a day will be taking that oil to China. They won't. The natural market are the refineries that are being sold by Petrobras. So in a sense, the country tends to continue to be integrated, even not being a single company country. So the private refineries, when they are finally private, they will run on Brazilian oil from other companies rather than Petrobras, plus some pre-salt oil, while Petrobras will pretty much process pre-salt oil and export everything else. So the country will continue to be integrated. This is the hypothesis that I want to bring here, and that I don't see a lot of discussion about it. The country will continue to be integrated. The guys that are buying Anchovy and Papo and all those fields, their primary market are refineries like Regape and other refineries. So the country will remain integrated. So there's no reason for us to believe that there will not be a market for the oil that will be produced even more than today in the mature fields that are being sold by Petrobras.
Okay, so guys, we understand that we must be punctual. So it was necessary to objectively ask for your final remarks. And I would like to start with Ricardo and then Mr. Bruce. And so, thanks again. Okay, to me it was a good class. Okay, about the oil market in the world. So, thank you again, and please, Ricardo, your final remarks, and then Bruce. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mauro, for this opportunity. And I'll do it a bit different. I'll ask Bruce a question, and please believe that we haven't arranged this before. The renewables market, Bruce. Some people believe that oil and gas companies should diversify and have oil and gas business, but also have wind farms and solar plants. Other people believe that it would be better from a global perspective that an entire new industry is created for renewables, and oil and gas companies continue to do what they're good, which is finding and producing oil and gas, because in the end of the day, demand for oil and gas will not be much lower in 2050 than it is today. What is your opinion, Bruce?
Interesting question to end up on. I think I agree with you that the international oil companies and oil companies in general, but the international oil companies are very good at finding and producing oil and gas. Some are better at finding, some are better at producing. For them to go into a completely new market, for example, solar. If they're not in solar at all, they've got to learn a new business, a new way to deploy the facilities and put them in place. They can do that. They know how to do it. But some of the technologies, offshore wind, are much closer to what they already do. They already put in facilities offshore. As we go to floating facilities, they definitely understand floating facilities. So there is a logical extension of what they do. Hydrogen is another form of a material or a gas liquid that has to be moved and dealt with, and they understand that. But I think there is some logic to them moving forward in those areas. But I agree, there will be companies that focus on renewables and may be better at it because that is their only focus. I think sometimes an international company gets so big and you can't do everything well. So sometimes you have to figure out where you are. Steve Jobs said that with Apple. Sometimes you have to say no a lot more than you say yes. And I think they're going to go through a series of trying to get in these new technologies. Some will be successful, some may not, and the success may be financially success. I think they can all come up with the technologies to do it. I think the service companies will benefit from that because whether you're putting in an offshore wind tower, or you're putting an offshore structure, it's some of the same companies that do that. So that seems logical to me that we'll see an extension of the service industries going forward. But I do agree with you. There seems a value to having those that deal with, in reality, electricity, as opposed to those that deal with fossil fuels that go to refinery that become electricity. And I think it'll be interesting to see how those play out. I do think there's a market for that. My other remark was going to be, in general, that if you are in the oil and gas industry, I believe you will benefit in the long term. If you can hang on, if you have a job, great. If you don't have a job, I think they'll be coming back. In my 45 years, I have seen it go up and down many times, and sometimes extreme up and downs. I have worked for 9 different companies, and 4 or 5 of those, I was either laid off, let go. One case I was fired, all because of the nature of our business. But I never have been out of work. I've always been able to find work doing something else, in some cases the next day. So I think if you're good at what you do and you like it, I would encourage you to stay in the oil and gas business and find a place. Now, maybe you move from oil and gas over into renewables in an oil and gas company. That's still an extension of what we do. So I think there is a long-term benefit of being in this business. This is just one of the harder times right now. And thanks for letting me join today.
Bruce, just one more thing. If you could give advice to young people who want to enter in this industry, only one, what would it be?
Flexibility. If you can get in, if you want to be in the industry, find a job in the industry. Most young students want to be a project manager. You are not going to get hired as a project manager. So be flexible. If you get hired as an offshore rig hand, you're in the industry. Learn that piece of business. I think we don't have enough people that have field understanding and need to come up through the ranks. If you are an accountant, learn to be an accountant in whatever way you can in the oil and gas business. Don't worry about what it is long term and be flexible for new opportunities. So I think people get too locked into they are just a reservoir geologist, or they're just a naval architect, or they're just an accountant. And they don't realize that people move between those roles as long as they understand the industry. I would encourage them to be flexible and look for opportunities to learn the business.
Thank you very much. Ricardo, your final remarks, please.
No final remarks. Just thank you and everybody that is listening to us, and thank Bruce. Thank you very much for being with us today. It was a pleasure.
Ok, pessoal, muito obrigado a todos que puderam participar. Como eu sempre digo, eu espero que tenha sido útil para todos vocês, porque uma coisa eu posso garantir, para mim foi muito útil. Eu aprendi muito essa noite com 2 feras como essa. Bruce, thank you again. Ricardo, thank you again. See you guys. Bye bye.